Hello and welcome to the second of our Lent talks this Lent about the Eucharist. Now, in a bit of feedback from what people were saying before, the thing that people really missed about our lockdown services and therefore these pre-recorded segments is pictures of my dog. So here is my dog catching bubbles. There we are. So as last week, in addition to this wee video, there will be a link to the Zoom meeting that we have on Wednesdays at 7 o'clock GMT in the evening. So please do join us for that if you possibly can. And there's also a physical meeting on Wednesday after the 11 o'clock service in Holy Trinity, or in the Trinity Centre. So this week we are going to be beginning where Claire left off last week, which was sort of the biblical evidence for the Eucharist. And we're going to work our way through a couple of centuries until the time of Constantine and just after. Now, Constantine, Emperor Constantine, was a really big thing because he was a Roman emperor who converted to Christianity around 313 AD, and therefore pretty much the whole of the Roman Empire converted with him. That was the point in time at which there was basically no longer any legal ability to persecute people because of their faith, because the Roman Emperor was a Christian. So basically, we're looking at the time from between about 100 AD and 350 AD, which is not easy. Because 100 AD, there weren't that many Christians around. So it's quite hard to know what they did. There's not a lot of evidence. One scholar thinks it's very likely that at about 100 AD, there were perhaps as few as 1,000 Christians, and a lot of them in Rome. And therefore, the level of evidence we have is very small. And of course, we're asking for quite a niche bit of evidence about the Eucharist, which would have been likely handed down in an oral tradition. In fact, we know it was handed down in an oral tradition rather than a written one. So what do we have? Well, we have some documents and some archaeological evidence. The first document, which is very useful, that's not in the Bible, is called the Didache. It was written about 100 AD and describes a sort of communion. There's this bit which you might find familiar, and this is a prayer which is said in front of the bread and the wine. As this broken bread is scattered over the mountains, was gathered and became one, so too may your church be gathered together from the ends of the earth into the kingdom, for glory and power are yours through Jesus Christ forever. So we say that in some of our liturgies in Holy Trinity, and that's from the Didache. That's 1900 and a bit years old. So around at the same time, 100 AD, we have Ignatius of Antioch, who was responding quite angrily to some folk who were doubting that Jesus was actually human. You'll find an awful lot of the texts you have at this time, this period before Constantine, are people falling out with each other because Christians did that really well. So anyway, he was responding to these people and almost tangentially emphasizes the reality of the belief of Christ's flesh and blood in the Eucharist. He says this: "Give heed to keep one Eucharist, for there is one flesh in our Lord Jesus Christ, and one cup into union with his blood. There is one altar, just as there is one bishop." But the really first massively helpful thing is from a guy called Justin Martyr. Now, he was writing, his name was Justin, and you can imagine what happened to him. Martyr wasn't his surname. And he was writing in about 150 AD. And he wrote what's known as an apology, which is actually a defense of Christianity. And this is some of what he wrote. "On the day called Sunday, all who live in cities or in the country gather together in one place, and the memories of the apostles or of the writings and prophets are read as long as time permits." The memories of the apostles or writings of the prophets are read as long as time permits. That's the liturgy of the word. Then when the reader has ceased, the priest verbally instructs and exhorts to the imitation of good things. Sermon. Then we all rise together and pray. Intercessions. And, as we before said, when our prayer is ended, bread and wine and water are brought, and the priest in the like manner offers prayers and thanksgivings according to his ability, and the people assent, saying, Amen. That's the Eucharistic prayer. And then there is a distribution to each. Communion. Now, Justin alludes a bit more to the Last Supper later on, but he was trying to counteract the claims made against the church in this defence of the church, and one of the claims was cannibalism. So he was quite careful not to go into too much about this is my body and this is my blood in that bit. But what Justin describes in 150 AD is pretty much the order that we do things today in our Eucharist. Readings, intercessions, sermon, the breaking of bread, the celebration of the Eucharist and distribution, and, according to Tertullian, another church father, and Ignatius, a hymn or two into the mix. Now, probably around this time, and it's really hard to be certain about anything surrounding the Eucharist at this time, they had developed at least two different types of celebration. And for want of better terms, we will call one of them the Eucharist, which of course means thanksgiving, and agape, which means love. An agape meal was a full meal, proper food and drink, but the emphasis was on feeding the poorer Christians who were in the group as well as sort of celebrating, and the richer holding back. There was bread and wine, but there was everything else laid on as well. And that sort of feast would have been very familiar to a lot of people, because it's not that dissimilar to the sort of Greco-Roman system of trade feasts. So if you were a member of a trade, Paul, remember, was a tent maker, you would go to your guild of tent makers and you would celebrate to the gods that you had as your tent makers, and you would dedicate the food to them and give them thanks and then eat. That was a very common thing to do for many people. This was not dissimilar for that, but it was about everybody. It wasn't about a trade. It was about everybody who was a Christian, whatever your race, your caste, your gender, your social position. But this form of meal was phased out by the time of Constantine, partly because folk were getting drunk and having a knees up, too much communion wine, and partly because Christianity had reached the point where it was moving away from a sort of house-based church. So let's talk about that a bit. Claire mentioned last week that the churches were based in people's houses, and that's right. I mentioned the one before a couple of years ago, which is a man called Titus Flavius Clemens, who was living in Rome at about 100 AD, sort of bang in the middle of our journey today. Now, if you go to the Colosseum, not far away from there is a church called San Clemente. Beautiful 15th century church, and you can go down the steps of the 15th century church into a church that the 15th century church was built on top of, because people just kept building, filling in the old things with rubble and building on top of them, so Rome got bigger and bigger over the centuries. And you can go below the first century church into the house of Titus Flavius Clemens, and that's why the above church is called San Clemente. It was named after him, Clemens. Clemens was a leader in the Roman church, and we know from the excavated remains of his house that this is likely where the first Christian churches in Rome met. So what happened in those churches? Well, we don't know much, but we do know some things that help us build up a picture. I know I'm being very cautious about this, but you've got to be very cautious about this because the evidence is so scant at this time. We know that the Eucharist was celebrated on a Sunday, probably nightfall on a Saturday or before dawn on Sunday, in accordance with the resurrection. We know it was celebrated in houses like Titus Flavius Clemens' house, and we know that as far as we can tell, it was a place where there was equality among the classes, that it was not ruled or run by rich people. We know that women tended to be the folk who ran the household in the Roman house, and so we think there's a likelihood that they, if not lead worship, which they very possibly did, then they ran the thing. So we can paint very different views as to the role of women or poor people or educated slaves or how equal things were. There's room for lots of speculation on that. We do know that there was lots and lots of disagreement, and there were lots of very strong-minded people about. And we know that from Paul's letters, they were often people who were not the hoi polloi, not the sort of top rank, the senatorial rank in the Roman Empire. We know that there were educated slaves, eunuchs, and women. So there is some evidence in the catacombs in Rome of women celebrating what looks like a Eucharist, and probably not an agape, judging by what's on the table in those pictures. But it's so long ago, and the church was so small that we can't expect to have a great deal of evidence. My own guess is that it was patchy. There were likely to have been wealthy women with big houses who ran the churches and celebrated the Eucharist and led worship. Paul mentions some of them, calling them apostles, fellow apostles, a title of great respect that he fought for. I'm sure there are places like the house of Clement of Rome, which is to say you can visit, where he was the leader of the men, he was the leader of the church. And he wrote letters, in fact, towards churches that were always falling out, and purportedly he was one of the early popes. But I do suspect that women had some central roles in many of the activities of the church, and the church was certainly growing at this stage. A number of documents that are very sparse from 100 AD start mushrooming into a demographic sort of blooming of evidence about 150, 200 and beyond. Christians started celebrating their major feasts like Christmas and Easter much more strongly and nearly publicly. And of course, the number of disagreements rose because these were passionate people who had different views, who were from different backgrounds. So disagreement is what you would expect, especially when it comes to something as ambiguous and difficult about the nature of Jesus and the nature of the Eucharist. But the crunch point in all of that was when Constantine converted to Christianity and issued a writ of tolerance saying you cannot persecute people for being a Christian. Everything changed because then Christianity stopped being a domestic religion, a religion of the household, and became one of the public sphere. That almost certainly meant that the ministry women celebrated in their churches came to an end because their public sphere was entirely male. It meant that the structure and liturgies and practices of the church came within Roman rule, and that meant that the people of lower rank, like slaves or equestrians or plebeians, would have been unlikely to have taken services or held positions of authority anymore. The robes that Claire and I wear on a Sunday, the chasuble and the stole, are remnants of Roman garments, the Roman cloak. The traditional deacon's robes are dymatic, derived from a Roman tunic, clothes of high status individuals in Rome. The name given to the popes, of which Clement was one, was Pontifex, which was the name given to the emperor of Rome and the supreme priest of the gods of Rome. Gone was the subjection too. There was no more persecution, there was no more martyrdoms. And in around 350 AD, the end of our era that we're looking at today, a woman called Egeria of Rome took a pilgrimage to Jerusalem and described the Christian worship that took place there in a very long letter. What she describes sounds almost no different to the medieval church of 1,000 years later. The many churches she visited, the many shrines to martyrs as well, and the Anastasis, as she called it, the resurrection church, almost certainly the traditional place of Jesus' tomb. At that place, monks and nuns gathered for the many prayer offices of the day, singing hymns and psalms antiphonally with lay people worshipping alongside them. And on the Sunday, a great many people gathered before dawn to the church next to the tomb, seated on the ground before the doors opened every Sunday. And when the cock crowed, the bishop came in, and there were psalms and prayers sung, and there were many thuribles full of incense until the whole place was full of fragrance. She doesn't describe the Eucharist in any great detail, but that's probably by this time it was so well known that she didn't need to write to her friends to tell them of the unusual practices, because the Eucharist was usual. So by the time of Constantine and after, the church is public, formal, liturgical and ordered, and so much has been gained and so much has been lost. It reminds me of that melancholic passage from the book of Ezra when the new temple of Jerusalem was rebuilt and there was a great formal occasion when the trumpets blazed and the old choir sang. And many older men and women wept when they remembered the older, smaller temple and many shouted for joy at the noise of the new until you could not distinguish the crying for the shouts of joy. And I can't help wondering, what would the church have been like had Constantine not converted? Would we have had our big cathedrals and churches that looked so much like Roman temples? Would we have had beauty and music in our worship in the way that we do? Would we have altars? Or would we have gathered round low tables like at the Last Supper? Would the church have survived? But one thing is sure, at this point, 350 AD, and for 1,000 years after at least, every Christian that was not a heretic believed one thing: the bread and wine of the Eucharist was the body and blood of Christ. All that would change in the Reformation, but not for 1,000 or 1,200 years. But while Constantine was declaring his tolerance towards Christianity and his faith in it, something else was going on the other side of the world, as they saw it. In Scotland, in Ireland, in England and in Wales, Christianity was beginning to take root in a place of trees and rain and holy wells, shamans and mystics. It was a fragile start, but it would become a faith which was wound deep into the psyche of these islands. And more of that next week. So our questions for discussion in our Zoom meeting and in our meeting on Wednesday. First of all, what can you see from your impression of the early church in our current Eucharist? When you think about the early church, what can you see of it that also is our current practice? What is there that you wish we could recapture in our current worship that was there in the house churches? What was there, present there, that needs to be present now? What would you miss if our worship was what it was in those early days, in a house gathered with various people? And for those of you who are from a background perhaps different to ours, have you ever been a part of a church that felt like that early church? I'd be fascinated to know. I look forward to seeing you at our Zoom meeting, and next week we discuss the Celtic Church in Britain and Ireland.